All right, good morning. It's fun to be here at NACIS for the first time, exploring this conference and sharing a little bit of work. This is somewhat preliminary work. I'm really looking for feedback regarding empty spaces on maps. And by empty spaces, I mean spaces that don't have anything in them. No information that would help us to turn that space into a place and really put some meaning to it. And I've been going to and exploring these places, just trying to get a feel for what they are and where they are. A lot of times in my introductory mapping and GIS classes, I like to ask the class, what's the reason that something might not appear on a map? And there's actually a lot of reasons for this, and this doesn't pretend to be an exhaustive list, but obviously selection decisions made by the cartographer will play into this, what things we decide to show and not show, but also other things like not being able to get the data or not being permitted to show the data or not even knowing that there's something there to show, so a lack of knowledge of the landscape. These empty spaces have consequences. Sometimes they're desired, sometimes they're not desired, and there's quite a range of consequences. Trevor Paglen talks about how blank spots in the map sometimes lead to blank spots in the law, so freedom from oversight and ability to operate without being known about. So sometimes people have sought out blank areas on the map to be protected from harm or to live in isolation, live on their own. And in other times, people have wanted to appear and be known, but have not been put on the map, and the result is marginalization. And so it's important to study these spots. I really like this quote by J. Brian Harley. He said, "There's no such thing as an empty space on the map." I invite my students to think about what that means. Obviously, there are empty spaces on maps, but that doesn't mean that there's nothing happening on the ground. There's always something going on in these spaces. And as I found, sometimes it's very interesting when you start drilling in and trying to find out what's going on there. Harley was interested in maps of European colonization of the Americas, Renaissance maps, and things with big monsters on them, like we learned how to make yesterday. And I never knew going to practical cartography day that I would learn that skill, but that's a good one in my toolbox. Also things like flags representing conquest, indigenous peoples are on these maps. And sometimes the words terra incognita, or land unknown, were on these. Now that's based on the perspective of the map maker, and each of us has our own terra incognita that's shaped by the maps that we see. Sometimes that is unknown land is diminished by what we see, sometimes it's reinforced. And so I was really interested in how these unknown lands or places played out in modern maps, both in a print context and electronic maps. A lot of my students have grown up to where almost all the maps they've seen in their life are these electronic ones that appear on their screen, Google Maps. So I want to understand what they're seeing and not seeing, and also how that compares to the more traditional print maps of the area. The questions I'm looking into are which places are most often left empty, and then why, and what's happening in those places that we should know about. The area that I chose to study was Washington State for a couple of reasons. As mentioned at the beginning, I work at Central Washington University, which is, the campus is exactly in the geographic center of Washington State. And so I have access to visit these places. I wanted to go there on the ground, see what was going on, look for things that couldn't be easily discerned in imagery. Also, I've lived in this state for most of my life, both on the west side and the east side, which are very different. And the majority of that was on the east side, which is more sparsely populated and has wound up having more of these empty areas. Finally, there's very diverse geography in this state, as you may have seen. If you flew over it and looked out the window, there's very arid landscapes, heavily forested ones, lots of different industry, populated places, rural areas, and so I thought it would make a good test area. Just some basic geography of the state. Most of the people live along the I-5 corridor running from the Canadian border down to Portland, and most of them live in this area around Puget Sound. But there are significant pockets of people living in the east side and near Spokane, as well as in the south central part of the state in the Yakima Valley and near the Tri-Cities area. These were the maps that I selected to study. I picked 3 common, very popular electronic maps, Bing Maps, Google Maps, and then the default rendered map on OpenStreetMap.org. Screenshot for the win here. As you may have seen yesterday's workshop, I did just screen capture these and then mosaic them like he showed and georeference them. At this scale, sometimes it was tough to get them to line up perfectly, but I believed it was good enough for the task. Google Maps, I actually had to georeference the screenshots individually and then mosaic because of the globe view that they've introduced, made it a little more challenging with the projection. I chose 3 popular print maps that I just went down and bought at the store or Amazon, I can't remember. Rand McNally Road Atlas, National Geographic Road Map and Guide, and then the Washington State Department of Transportation publishes their highway map both in print and as a PDF online. So I scanned these in and georeferenced them, so they're all 6 maps lined up, and then I could start experimenting with some methods to find out which areas were most consistently blank. I tried both manual and automated methods. This is just experimentation. There could be way better ways to do this, which is why I'm interested in getting feedback. The simplest way that I've found was just to make a fishnet grid to overlay on the map, and the cells were 5 kilometers by 5 kilometers. And then I just looked individually at each cell, and if it had nothing in it, then I marked it. Now, some of these maps have like shaded relief terrain in the background, and I ignored that for the purposes of this because I didn't want that to influence the result and just get flat places as being empty. So I did take that into account. And so I marked the cells that were observed as empty for the different maps. And these were some of the results. So the electronic maps had much more empty area in them, which, thinking about it, it made sense to me in the sense that these are multi-scale maps and they're designed to be that way, so it's expected that you might zoom in and be able to see more detail. At the same time, I would mention that if you don't see anything at one scale, you might not know that you could zoom in and see more, and so there is still that element of terra incognita that you're dealing with at these scales. Now, all these maps were at about the 1 to 1 million scale when I captured them, and the print maps were roughly that scale as well. They didn't match up perfectly, but I felt it was well enough to do this experiment. The paper maps had much less empty space. The cartographers working at a single scale and having a more manual part of the process had tried to cram in, obviously, more things into the map. Labels were curved. Things were really positioned so that as much as possible could be put onto those maps at those scales. So there's much less empty area in those. This was a result when you added up all the maps that were empty for each cell. And so consistently empty areas are starting to show up in dark colors here, particularly along the Columbia River in south central Washington, in the northern Columbia Basin on the east side of the state, and in southwest Washington. I tried some other methods that were automated. I wanted to deal with the case where there were a few features but not much, and generally looking at the lightness of the color in the map, as all these had a light background. So a way that I tried was just converting each map to grayscale and then tallying the average pixel value within the fishnet cell. And then looking at the histogram of the results, there was a pretty clear place where the color got to be roughly the background color of the map. So was able to discern the areas of the map that were typically lighter colored than others. This was a challenge because different maps have different design decisions, and some colors, when converted to grayscale, show up as darker than others. But it generally showed the areas where the background color came through. Again, much more of those appearing on the electronic maps than the print ones. This is the composite showing the totals there, and features are starting to stand out. You can see, the central forested area in the Cascade Mountains is largely national forest and national parks, which are heavily symbolized. Other features, such as the Yakima Valley, are showing up here, where you can see there's a lot of activity going on in the map. Finally, I wanted to choose some kind of method, or try some kind of method that would be a little more fine-grained than the 5 kilometer by 5 kilometer cells, and this was totally experimental, but I converted each map to grayscale again, and threw down 100,000 random points on the grayscale map and extracted the pixel values, and then used an interpolation method to create kind of a smooth surface to understand which areas were lighter than others in color. And was able to define a cutoff value that represented more or less the background color of the map. And so this resulted in kind of smoother looking results, but similar ones geographically to the previous method with the average grayscale value. This one, though, because it's more fine grained, you see starker patterns. So you can see Interstate 90 running across the state here. You can see the Hanford nuclear site is heavily symbolized in many of these maps. Other types of landscapes are not, and they lead to interesting patterns like this vertical line here, right near Ellensburg where I live. So what caused that? These are both public lands. The Wenatchee National Forest is on the west side, and that was, again, heavily symbolized in many of these maps. On the east side of that line is the Washington State Department of Fish and Wildlife, L.T. Murray Wildlife Area. And this is a beautiful arid landscape. I like to go running out in these hills, and it doesn't appear in a lot of maps. So public lands at the state level and more local levels were not coming into these maps very frequently. So then I wanted to get to the really empty areas. So areas that were identified as pretty empty in all three methods. I put those together in this composite map, and I guess I had the desire to define real nice, nicely shaped empty spots on the map. So if you put a convex hole around that, you can kind of give it some shape. And then these are the 20 largest ones. And so I started to see those clustering in certain parts of the state. Here's with the Esri background map for some context. Esri was not part of the experiment, but this gives you some geographic idea, again, of where these places were in relation to other features on the landscape. So it was time then to go there and make some site visits and try to see if there's any kind of signage going on, what was happening. I studied a lot of satellite imagery. I talked to people in the local area and looked at land ownership maps, especially to try and see what kinds of activities were happening, and found some patterns going on after visiting. These were the ones that I could get to, or at least very close to, within the past month or two. So one thing is that these empty spaces supply and rely on urban consumption. So a lot of things are going on in these blank spots on the map that are supporting day-to-day lives in our context here. Whether that's turning on a light switch or building a building or going to the grocery store and getting food. For example, the areas in southwestern Washington are heavily logged. This is an area where there's very heavy rainfall, moderate temperatures, and good soil, where Douglas fir and other species will grow very quickly. And so these are largely commercial logging operations where the forest is clear-cut and then reseeded, and then within 50 years it will grow up to the point where it will be harvested again. And so the landscape is carefully managed by these companies, and also the state of Washington, which performs logging in the area in the same fashion to support local budgets. Many of these logs go to the mill in Raymond, Washington, shown in the lower right, where they're turned into boards and lumber and other products that you can buy at Home Depot or Lowe's, or they're shipped overseas for building at the ports of Olympia or Longview. And so these landscapes, if you look at them, you see trees in all different stages of growth. These areas are also used to support electricity generation, especially along the Columbia River in south central Washington. There are many, many wind farms taking advantage of that air that's constantly rushing through the gorge. And these are not heavily populated areas. There's just maybe a few ranchers in these places. The White Creek Wind Project is directly in one of the blank spots that I identified. Its website boasts it as being one of the largest wind projects associated with public utility districts, and most of those districts are on the more heavily populated west side of the state. In this same area goes most of the Northwest's trash. This is near some of those empty spots. There are two very large landfills where trash is brought on rail cars from the more populated areas of western Washington, as well as all over the state, and as far away as Alaska. The city of Spokane burns their trash in an incinerator, and then the ashes go to this landfill where a Swedish company then mines them for metals that can be taken out of the ash, and then it's laid to rest in this big pit. There's also a power plant that produces the natural gas products from the methane beneath the landfill, and there are two of these on either side of the Columbia River there, one in Oregon and one in Washington. Also, these empty spaces are supporting massive commercial operations. I talked about the logging in southwest Washington and Pacific County. These landowners own most of the blank spots in the map. And much of the land, as I'll show later, is gated off, so it cannot be accessed or known easily by the public without a permit. There's areas are home to large farms and ranches. This is from the map that I showed in the title slide. In the upper right is the Tri-Cities area, Richland, Pasco, and Kennewick. This is home to about 300,000 people. Just to the southwest is an enormous farm that's about the same size as that urban area. It's operated by Agri Northwest. They produce potatoes, onions, and other crops from water that's pumped up into these center pivot irrigation systems from the Columbia River. This land is owned by a subsidiary of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints operating in Utah, which also has a significant presence in the Tri-Cities. They've invested in a lot of farmland throughout the country. In the upper left, you see the Horrigan Ranch. This is a dryland wheat farm that's been used for cattle ranching and wheat growing for many years, back to at least the 1950s, and I'm still drilling into that one to see how long it's been there. Some empty spaces are empty just because they're plain difficult to access. Maybe that's for human geography purposes. People have restricted access to the land. It used to be that you could go on these logging roads, and then because of vandalism, dumping, and other things, they have been gated off. In other cases, the physical geography prevents traversing the landscape very easily. So this is Alder Creek, which is a small creek running into the Columbia River. You can see its mouth down here. But a lot of the tributaries flow through kind of these deep carved out gorges and canyons. So building a road north to south or east to west on here would be very difficult. Empty spaces finally are home to many people who just want to get away, and I was viewed with no small amount of suspicion sometimes when driving to these places, even on public roads, people asking what I was doing out there. Here's people for two different reasons seeking out an empty space on the map. Eagle Springs Ranch is marketed to as a place where you can just go and park your RV or ride your horse or do whatever. And it's subdivided with many, many owners, most of whom don't live in eastern Washington, but have bought these parcels of land. Now, it's turned out that these locations have been generally really far away from any kinds of services, and it's hard to do anything on the land. So this parcel has been for sale for about 4 years, at well under its value, and it's maybe difficult to get rid of once you get a hold of. Others have come here for religious or community purposes. The Hutterites are a group traced back to the Anabaptist movement hundreds of years ago. They came to America originally in the Dakotas and the prairie provinces of Canada, and in the 1950s came to eastern Washington state and developed colonies where they live communally, trying to get to the empty spots on the map, I would say. Now, sometimes that's difficult because of algorithmic cartography. So in the Geographic Names Information System, one of these Hutterite colonies is in there, and it frequently appears in Google Maps at the same level as Moses Lake, which has 20,000 people just down the road. And because of, I don't know how Google does it, but my feeling is they're trying to fill the empty spaces on the map with places, and these places come up. So in conclusion, Harley was right. There is no such thing as an empty space on the map. I'm learning so much. There's a lot of interesting things going on that I don't have time to talk about. What I would like to do, though, my dream is to get together with people who really know what they're doing with a camera, as well as people who could interview folks who live near or around these spaces, create ethnographies, poetry, photography. They could come together into a multidisciplinary exhibit. We have a museum at our University of Culture and the Environment. I think it'd be real fun to have a museum exhibit where people can learn about these empty spaces on the map. Certainly me considering myself a local, I've learned so much about these places, and it's been exciting to do. So I really welcome your feedback and ideas, and thank you for your attention today.